The BBC has refused to rule out bringing back a documentary that was pulled after it emerged that it had featured the son of a Hamas official, and the BBC was accused of, quote, parroting Hamas propaganda.
Took the decision quite quickly to take it off iPlayer while we do this deep dive. That's what's happened.
So it could come back after editing
I'm
or
not,
something?
I'm not
there's questions of accuracy
I'm not
and
ruling
coercion.
anything. I'm not ruling anything out.
Watch the shock in the room as the BBC admitted the film could return to our screens.
I suppose the question is the accuracy of the film. So there might also be, conversely, a danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The thing's been withdrawn from iPlayer. Obviously, transparency was lacking there. So, I mean, there's also this letter going around, I think originally 500 media professionals, now 1,000, who've said that it was an overreaction. You could delete, edit or put the health warnings in. Because this was a kid whose dad had that job title, and I don't know if it's in some of these regimes. I know with the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, from having constituents there, and I know from Bangladesh having roots there, that to be a doctor, you had to be in that party.
Right.
So we don't know, did this individual have prior warning of October the 7th? Were they involved? Do you know what I mean? It could be that...
I'll ask Tim to answer some of the detail on that. But I do want to make it... I'll ask Tim to answer the detail. I want to make it quite clear that the idea that we see that what's happening in Gaza through the eyes of children is a good documentary idea. It really is. It's a good. When I was in current affairs, my Gaza, as it were, was Northern Ireland. And if somebody said, let's look at the troubles through the eyes of children, it's a good documentary idea. I do not want anybody to think that's not the case. What we're talking about is the execution of that idea and the level of trust that took place in the BBC and the independent production company. And I'll let Tim pick up on that.
Yeah, I think, firstly I'd say nothing's more important than we're trusted. And you know, we have actually built trust over it. So you can imagine that I think there's a lot of frustration and disappointment. It's not about the BBC and people like myself, but we're very sorry to the audience because we don't want to be in a position where we have flaws in the programme making. And overall, I am proud of the way we're covering some of these polarised, fiendishly difficult events where many of our journalists, as you know, are under enormous pressure, ferocious lobbying, and it's been extremely difficult. But in this case, there are flaws. When you know, people say to me, well, you had to have external challenge. We do get external challenge. I get external challenges reported on from various institutions and other people questioning our programming. And it's appropriate. I'm editor-in-chief. And if someone says, you've got a problem here, it's quite right that I go and ask the teams and say, have we got a problem? And dig into it. In this case, we got challenges. But
organisations were...
Various challenges. But, well, I think overall we had it depends what you call. Sorry, I'm not being evasive. I think on the log this morning there was about 500 odd complaints about the film being biased against Israel. We had about 1,800 wanted to put the film back, but then we had some serious complaints from various parts of the, we have various complaints from different people in terms of, and various organisations in terms of their concern about this programme. There were specific concerns, as you know, and we've been highly transparent in my view in terms of, and that's how I try to deal with these things, in terms of saying there was a specific question around, but bear with me, around the father of the boy. And as we dug into it, we've been totally transparent, we found out that we were not told. Now, to your point, you can debate the materiality of that, you can talk about, but in my view, if you're asked a number of times and that question was not answered, and from our side, and we have fantastic teams by the way, and I certainly think under the pressure they're under, you've got to understand some of these situations, but the level of curiosity you ask, is there anything more I know? That is basics, and at the end of the day, as editor-in-chief, I have to be secure, not only editorially where the film's at, but the making of that film. And at that point, quite quickly, I lost trust in that film. Therefore, I have took the decision quite quickly to take it off iPlayer while we do this deep dive. That's what's happened.
So it could come back after editing
I'm
or
not.
something.
I'm not.
Questions of accuracy
I'm not
and
ruling
coercion.
anything. I'm not ruling anything out. What the chair has said is actually right. Is do I think this is a valid and
was it accurate? Was there coercion involved? Those kind of things.
That is why I think we've done a good first initial bit of initial work that tells you more than enough to say tells me more than enough that there are flaws. But I want to do a forensic analysis of. There's a lot of things floating around in terms of budget, all of those things. We want to make sure we've done the forensic analysis of the process, the editorial, and do the work.
When it was released, protests erupted around BBC headquarters in London as Brits fumed that there was a chance their licence fee could have gone towards paying Hamas.
Gideon, just to get things straight, how many people do you think were at the protest last night? Because I was hearing reports that it was 100, 150. Others have been telling me it was more like 1,500, 2,000.
It was certainly more than 1,000 people. I think the 150 comment came from a journalist who arrived before we actually started. And then suddenly the streets were filling up and it spilled out all the way out into the road. So if you know where the BBC is, the whole place was surrounded and they actually had to close the front entrance to the building to keep the crowds contained.
But let's get to the point of this protest, because the more that we learn about this documentary, the more extraordinary it becomes, that money might well have gone from BBC coffers, from taxpayers' pockets, from licence fee payers' pockets, into the hands of Hamas officials.
I mean, this is the thing, Campaign Against Anti-Semitism is a charity, and I know the kind of safeguarding policies that we have to have. At the BBC, it is inconceivable that they broadcast an hour-long film featuring children without having to go through those safeguarding processes of figuring out who the child's parents are and asking whether they're happy for their children to be on screen, whether they're happy for different things to be said. And then they've paid about £400,000 of licence fee payers' money for this programme to happen. And who are you paying it to, BBC? This is a real question. With all this safeguarding check that has to happen, and then they've had to send £400,000 somewhere, and how does one even get money into Gaza at the moment? There are a lot of questions to answer about how all of this has happened. And it's just inconceivable, to me anyway, that some of this money hasn't ended up in the hands of Hamas. And I think that was a real bone of contention amongst everybody who was protesting last night. Licence fee payers saying, what on earth have you done with our money? Have you sent it as a new low for even the BBC to a proscribed terrorist organisation?
Yeah, I mean, some of the revelations are quite extraordinary. The way that the subtitles for the documentary translated often a Jew or Jews to Israel or Israeli forces. For example, an interviewee praised the Hamas leader for jihad against the Jews, and that was mistranslated by the BBC to say he was fighting Israeli forces. Now, that's a huge, huge difference, isn't it, Gideon?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people were, at the beginning of this story, the BBC was saying, oh, we paid a production company and maybe we should have added a couple of subtitles here and there. To mention that the child's father is a senior figure in Hamas, getting all of the way through to subtitling, which is something which, is so straightforward. The BBC have clearly decided to cover for terrorists here. The BBC could just be honest that Hamas is an organisation which has a race-based genocidal ideology that wants to see all Jews murdered, and translate the subtitles properly, or they can try and cover for Hamas by sort of making it a little bit more palatable. Oh, they didn't say jihad, they said resistance.
Well, it seems as though they were trying to make it a little bit more palatable, Gideon. I'm so sorry, but we've come to the end of the hour, so we're going to have to leave it there. But thank you very much indeed, Chief Executive of the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism.
Now, of course, we have reached out for the BBC for comment, but they are yet to get back to us.
The BBC has faced charges of bias since the October 7th attacks, after a slew of reporting errors.